if you've been to any of our webinars. And I should introduce myself. I'm Mary Zirkle with AFSC and the Community Safety Beyond Policing program project. We're just trying to use the chat. We don't want to distract from the speakers, but we usually get a really lively conversation going in the chat. So please feel free to do that. And I'm just gonna pop a first question, and just to get us thinking about our subject tonight, and just share in the chat what you have been hearing about the state of violence in the United States right now. What have you been seeing in the media? What are your neighbors saying? What's the conversation on the playground when you're dropping off the kids? And Maggie saying increasing gun violence. Yep. Things are getting more and more unsafe. That's correct. Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing that in Chicago for sure. What about other folks? Yeah, people are fearful of carjacking, fearful of violence. There's chaos, increase during the pandemic or the epidemic. That's right. Yeah, it feels like a lot of the what we're hearing in the media, and possibly just people in their own experiences, are speaking about an increase in crime. News stories of kids getting shot. Exactly. Yeah, CTA trains becoming more violent. Some are blaming immigrants for an increase in crime. Thank you, Maggie, for lifting that up. Yeah, so I mean, this is what the context that sort of we're in right now, that we're hearing these kinds of stories. So we know it's a really complex topic, and from the perspective of this project, which is really seeking non-police solutions, we thought it was really important to get together and just try to unpack this issue and talk to some practitioners, some people working in communities to address these problems. So we're going to do that, and I am going to invite some of my colleagues to kind of just give us some context setting. And first, we're going to have Akira Rose, who is our Youth Activism Fellow in the New York, New Jersey Healing Justice Program, and we're super excited to have them here. So Akira, you want to take it away?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Akira, and you can see by the slide, this is our very lovely mayor here in New York City. So the narratives around gun violence have kind of taken a turn into legislative measures that aim to roll back recent reforms around bail and age limits for folks who are, underage, who are being tried as adults, right? So the bail reform is essentially letting nonviolent offenders, go get out of jail without having, bail, because as we know, it's a barrier to a lot of people who have who are from low-income backgrounds. And so when that law was passed, people kind of made a ruckus about it because, or it was used as a way to, almost as a gotcha, where people were like, well, this increase in gun violence is happening now because folks who were out on bail are now, causing chaos, right? And so they use that as a reasoning for rolling back bail reform here in New York. And another thing that's happening is around Raise the Age, where young people who are 16 and 17 used to be tried as adults in New York City. And, there was legislation to make that, kind of eradicate that from happening. These are things that are being re-legislated, and we're kind of like trying to fight back against these narratives in a really big way because they're damaging to our communities. So yeah, I mean, all of these legislative measures, is along with the fact that we have Eric Adams, who used to be a former police chief, as our mayor, it kind of is cementing these like stop and frisk era policies, right? Where people were, being actively harmed by the NYPD, just walking down the street. And so those are the kinds of things that, this gun violence narrative contributes itself to. It lends itself to being able to roll back all of these reforms that have happened in the past few years.
Yeah, thank you, Akira. I think you said that so well. I appreciate that perspective, and it's really clear in New York. You can really see how these things that folks have really fought for, and was so exciting to see reforms like that made that really did make a difference in people's lives. And now these narratives causing this backlash. And we kind of mentioned it in our initial round of that question. People were talking about what the media says, and that little phrase, if it bleeds, it leads. There is a way that the media is ginning up some of this stuff. And the other thing I think is interesting is that a lot of local media outlets have closed, like thousands of them in the past number of years. So we have fewer outlets kind of putting out these stories that are more probably nationally oriented too. So there's a lot of little threads to pull. So we're going to pass it over to Tori Bateman now, who is going to give us the federal legislative sort of angle on this story. Thank you so much, Akira. Tori Bateman's our policy advocacy coordinator in our Office of Public Policy and Advocacy in Washington, D.C. So take it away, Tori.
Thanks, Mary. Hey, everybody. Good to be here with you. As Mary said, I work on policy for AFSC here in D.C., which means that I have the joy of getting to spend a lot of time deep in federal budgets and looking at the numbers, which is often a fun thing and often pretty depressing. And as Akira said, we've seen a backlash to the movement to defund police as a result of gun violence in the US and other rhetoric from the political right. And this has really had an impact on those budgets that I'm watching. Really, we can see it all over the media and in politics. I have a couple quotes up on the screen that you can take a look at the State of the Union. As many of you will remember, President Biden went really hard on the fund the police narrative. He said, we should all agree the answer is not to defund the police, it's to fund the police, fund them with resources and training, which was a huge disappointment to advocates who had really expected a little bit more nuance in that conversation. There's also moderate Democrats who have been really outspoken with their desire to put more resources into policing instead of less. Rep. Gottheimer from New Jersey said there's always room for reforms and to do better, but defunding the police makes no sense. I think more investment and training should be put in. Things like cameras are something that law enforcement supports. And then another moderate Democrat, Representative Spanberger from Virginia, did a whole PR trip to the local police department. I put some photos there so you can see just how well photographed this particular field trip was for that representative. But she, hung out with the police, did ride-alongs, and used it really as a photo op to appear supportive of continuing to fund the police. And this has had a really big impact, this rhetoric from the administration, from moderate Democrats, and especially also the right, who is really pushing this narrative of they're trying to take away the police, they're trying to defund the police, and we have to do something about it. It's had a real impact. If you want to go to the next slide, the president did release the 2023 federal budget request just recently, and it very explicitly says that he wants to put more officers on the beat. That's a direct quote from the summary that the administration put together. It calls for increasing the budget for the ATF, that's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, explicitly to expand what they're calling strike forces for gun trafficking. It included a total of $6.2 billion to support grant programs that come from the government, or federal government, to local police departments, things like the Burn Justice Assistance Grants. There was $2.8 billion in there for Community-Oriented Policing Services Office, which administers the COPS grants, to implement strategies to combat violent crime. And there was also a whopping $30 billion in new mandatory spending for law enforcement. A lot of that money was specifically for things like hiring new police officers, and just generally was a really shocking increase to see in this budget, and directly a result of this backlash that we're talking about. I do want to note, though, that the movement to divest from police and invest in good stuff hasn't been a total wash. And this budget did see some wins on the investment side, and that seems to be a place where the movement is winning. At least a little bit. It's slowly winning. There is $5 billion in this budget for the Community Violence Intervention Initiative at the Center for Disease Control, which is a public health agency, not one of the securitized, Department of Justice or Department of Homeland Security programs. That focuses on things like strengthening economic supports, youth skill building. There's mentoring and after school programs that get funded through that, mental health treatment. They do mediation. So money available for non-carceral alternatives to violence prevention. There was also money in there for Project Prevent grants, which is a Department of Education program that works on conflict resolution and counseling services that are based in schools. And I also want to flag that in the American Rescue Plan, so not this budget, but previous to this budget release, there was grants to states to start planning for how to offer non-police mobile crisis intervention, and then to provide federal reimbursement for those services as well. So that's a good chunk of money that's going into some of the alternatives, but we have a lot here to work on in terms of actually taking money out of the harmful systems and the policing that is doing a lot of harm in our communities. We're seeing that.
No, finish, go ahead. I was just agreeing, but yeah.
Sorry, wasn't sure if I was up on my time. But yeah, the federal budget, we're seeing a lot more police funding, thanks in part, to these moderate Democrats and others who are really reacting to the right's messaging on safety and to the fear-based rhetoric that we're hearing around safety needing more policing. They're not staying rooted in values, right? Like we had such a huge movement and such just good support for the Black Lives Matter movement over the past 2 years. That's really sort of dissolved into this reactive messaging around needing to support more police funding from a lot of these moderate Democrats. But we're also seeing some progress in reframing safety issues as something that starts with building healthy communities and giving resources to communities and making sure folks have opportunities.
Yeah,
we still have a lot of work, but the budget is showing us that we have opportunities in the investment side as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad you are putting in that positive piece there. There's language floating around now around the social determinants of public safety, I think in the People's Response Act, that I think is really, the framing that we've all been working on is sort of getting into the discourse. And I think that's really positive. I know in Illinois, we're starting to see the mobile crisis intervention services that were funded under the American Rescue Plan are starting up. They've been, I know at least 3 communities nearby where they're beginning. And so we're starting to see the fruits of that. But really upsetting to see this huge expansion in federal money for police, where we think of policing as a local and state usually funded entity. So, the idea that the right uses soft on crime rhetoric is nothing new. And it is, something we're going to have to really be thinking about moving forward, because we're in a dangerous time where we were at the precipice, as you were saying, with our movements of really making some change. And, this fear-based rhetoric can be pretty tough. Thank you so much, Tori. And I'm going to invite now my kind of co-facilitator, my comrade, John Lindsay Poland, who is our co-director for the California Healing Justice Program, is gonna kind of help us try to interpret a little bit about what kind of information on violence and policing do we even see, and how do we think about that. So go ahead. I'm going to hand it over to you, John.
Thank you so much, Mary and Tori and Akira, for setting this up. The proposals from the Biden administration that Tori talked about are based on some assumptions, right? They're based on assumptions about violence and about what actually affects or reduces violence and what increases it. And those assumptions may be held by President Biden and others in the federal government, and they're also held by people in our communities, right? We may, live with people or be close to people who share those assumptions. We may even have those assumptions, right? So here are just a couple headlines, for example, about a poll that found that 2/3 of those polled believe that boosting police funding would cut crime, and that 75% thought that defunding the police had caused the increase in crime over the last 1 to 2 years. And then even, the politicization of this by some that says, oh, the Democratic controlled cities wanted to, they cut the funding for police, and those are the cities where homicides went up. And in fact, that's not really the case. This is a USA Today article that debunks that particular claim. But I wanted to explore with you all just what information we can look at. What information should we look at? So if you can take the next one. So it is very true that gun homicides have gone up in the last 2 years. This is just data from 2020. There were increases in gun homicides in 2021 as well from 2020, not quite as dramatic as you see here. These are graphs from the last 20 years, and you can see that the number of gun homicides was relatively stable until the last few years. And then they spike up in 2020. Well, what happened in 2020? I seem to think like there was a pandemic. So we'll look at that in just a moment, but it is very true. Like the perception that people have that there's been, at least at the national level, it's like in the aggregate, there has been an increase in violence. If you can go to the next one. So at the same time, if you look at this at more of an historical level per capita, even with that spike, so the gun homicide rate is that golden line, that orange line, and it definitely spiked in the last couple of years. There's no question about it. But if you compare that over a 50-year period, then it's a dramatic change, but it is not historically much greater than what those rates were in say the 70s or even in the early 90s. We can go to the next one. And then if we look at what cities, and I wish I had a better graph than this, but this is a splatter graph of cities spending, the changes in their spending on police. So all these yellow dots, the horizontal line in the middle represents no change in police spending in that city. And all of the dots above that line represent increases in police spending in those cities in 2021. So in the wake of the social justice mobilization in 2020, and the cities below that line represent decreases in police funding in 2021. It is very important to note that this graph was made a year ago. We don't have a graph that shows the decisions about police spending this year, but I am confident that there would be many, many fewer cities below the line that have actually decreased police spending on net from 2019 or 2020 in the last 2 years, because within the last year, many of the cities that actually decreased funding reversed those decisions. So trying to attribute any changes in violence or gun violence, particularly, to defunding the police is not a realistic endeavor. And then you can go city by city and you can see that there is no correspondence, there's no correlation that you can point to. You can go to the next one. So what has happened is that the pandemic was the precipitating factor of an enormous number of gun purchases, particularly in the first few months of the pandemic, and particularly by new owners of guns. You know, gun ownership is very concentrated within the United States. There are many people who own multiple guns, and then a lot of people don't own any. So these were a lot of people who had never owned a gun before, who purchased one in the first months of the pandemic. There was a kind of a fear buying spree. Gun shops were open when other things were shut down. And then there's data, the blue on the right shows that a lot of guns turned up quickly at crime scenes. The time to crime between a gun purchase and a gun offense is particularly important because it shows a relationship between the purchase and the crime. And the time to crime for many of these purchases was very short. So it's one of the contributing factors. It's not the only one, but you know, it was an important one. There's also a lot of indicators that the economic crisis, as well as the mental health crisis, which has resulted in some increases in youth suicide, particularly, have also been contributing factors to the growth in gun violence in the last 2 years. Of course, the data is very fresh. A lot of times, in a lot of places, there's not even the data, but to sort of say, oh, well, it's because of a reduction in police spending that there's been this increase in crime, or that an increase in police spending would address the increase in violence, just is not based on good evidence. So to talk more about specific experiences, we're going to turn to two people who are working in communities where, you know, like all communities, there is violence, and have been particularly working in ways to reduce that violence without increasing police spending, without essentially non-law enforcement strategies. So first, we're going to turn to Jonathan Pulfas, who is with the American Friends Service Committee and with Cure Violence in St. Louis. Jonathan is a learner, a writer, an organizer. He's from St. Louis. He graduated from St. Louis University and is a program associate with AFSC. And he works with young people to help them realize their own power to create change. And he's also the host of Learn Sawati, which are monthly studies in Black studies. So we'll hear from Jonathan, then we're going to turn to Sam Vaughn, and we will have time for some discussion with Jonathan and Sam. So as you're listening, please do you know, think about questions you have or responses, because we will have some time with them to address those. So take it away, Jonathan. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, John, for that introduction. Hello, everybody. Thank y'all for joining this call. I want to give you all an overview of one of the organizations that received funding to start up the Cure Violence program here in St. Louis, and then give you all some more background on the program itself and some implications moving forward. So one of the sites that received the funding for Cure Violence was Employment Connection. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started on just some background, give y'all an agenda of what I plan to cover. You can go to the next slide. So we're going to just cover some history, talk about its mission, vision, a kind of a paradigm shift that it brings, talk about the St. Louis sites. Those are the ones that I've worked intimately with. Talk about the areas of working and some success stories. You can go to the next one. Yeah, so Cure Violence was originally under the name Ceasefire, and it was based out of Chicago. A doctor named Dr. Gary Slutkin, who's an epidemiologist, studies the trends of diseases, ended up starting an organization following some of the work that he did abroad to respond to the epidemic of gun violence and homicides in the city of Chicago. And so what he ended up doing was piloting the program at West Garfield Park in Chicago, and within, I believe, a year, they saw a 67% drop in gun violence in that particular area in which the workers that were employed through that pilot were able to do their work. And so between 2008 It expanded to several areas in the U.S., some major cities, and also internationally. And then to this day, it's currently in all continents throughout the world. So the program has seen success in different communities with ranging cultural backgrounds, ranging policies and things like that. Currently in the U.S., it has 20 sites, so Atlanta, Baltimore, New York, New Orleans, Minneapolis, San Antonio, etc. And St. Louis being one of the newly formed sites back in May of 2020. In fact, the U.S. Attorney General, it's funny we talk about these politicians and these narratives that they create about the need to fund police to address violence. The former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder described Cure Violence as a rational, data-driven, evidence-based, smart approach to crime. It's a lot of prepositions he used to describe it, but essentially that's in a nutshell the history of the organization. You go to the next slide. And so the mission of the organization is to address violence globally using disease control and behavior change methods. And so the same way in which it's from a public health approach. So the same way you, like I said, the doctor who founded it, Dr. Slutkin, he came from a background of epidemiology. So the same way that they will look at how to treat and how to attack and how to address AIDS and other, infectious diseases and things like that. You can list a whole list of them, right? They apply the same approach using disease control and behavior change methods, and they describe violence as a contagious problem, right? And so it's not looked at from the lens of criminality. Instead, it's looked at as a health issue. And so at the bottom, you can see this table where it outlines just the paradigm shift that the program tries to offer. Whereas in the past, we looked at the decisions that people made tied to gun violence as like from a moralistic view, right and wrong. They incorporate data, evidence, things like that, science to help try to explain what's going on. Instead of looking at people like bad individuals, like villains and things like that for some of the decisions that they make, this approach looks at the outcomes from a perspective of them being learned behaviors. Instead of criminalizing people, criminalizing communities, calling them gangs, this program refers to those individuals or those groups of people as groups in community norms, right? And instead of looking at imprisonment as a solution to address a lot of the ills that are happening in the community, we believe in change, prevention through change behavior. So you go to the next slide. And so the St. Louis area launched in May of 2020, and there was campaigns or efforts to really bring it to the city of St. Louis for a minute. Just because St. Louis, for those who don't know, was murder capital one, I believe, it's been like that for a minute. I think it's shifted. We're in not competition like it's a game, but we're definitely still in that front run. And so it came to St. Louis to try to provide an alternative to the police as a conduit for addressing violence in the community. Two of the sites that got it, one of them that you all may be familiar with, the Urban League, of course, but with the CEO here is Mike McMillan. But Sal Martinez is CEO of the Employment Connection site based in St. Louis alongside Mike Millen's work with the Urban League. And so there's 3 locations that the sites are based out of. It's the west side of St. Louis, that's Wells Goodfellow. It's the south side of St. Louis, that's Dutchtown, and there's Walnut Park. And across these 3 different areas of the city, there's about 24 staff, 8 station per site. And because of the success of the program, preliminarily, like within its first year or 2 of it being launched, just been year 2, we're coming up on year 2, 6 or 7 new sites are expected to open in St. Louis. Now, in some cities where this program has been in place for a while, like New York, they have about 13, 14 sites. And I explain how the sites are kind of run and what area they cover and what's expected of people who work there in the next slide. So you go to the next one. So part of what there's 2 positions that are really the foundation of the Cure Violence program in order to get it to work, essentially. And so there's the violence interrupters. And so their motto is to detect and identify conflicts that are happening within the area in which they serve, the area in which they work. And so when they identify or detect, that can be from conversations they're having with neighbors in the community. That can be from them going out canvassing and overhearing things that are happening. And their job is to de-escalate those issues. And there's a range that violence interrupters are able to play in when it comes to conducting mediations. But for the purposes of this presentation, I don't have that much time to go into that, but violence interrupters play an essential role with the success of the Cure Violence program. And then you have outreach workers. So outreach workers are still like VIs, are still violence interrupters. They still detect and identify conflict and try to address those different things before they escalate to cure violence. And I like that note, Teresa, that you made. It definitely is. We definitely need more sisters and women involved in the work. They provide an invaluable perspective and contribution to the work. And that includes different identities as well. But I want to definitely lift that up, Teresa. But the outreach workers are essentially like social workers / case workers. They're not social workers, but they essentially function as, so they have a case of about 15 to 20 high-risk individuals. So by high risk, the organization defines it as people who have been formerly incarcerated, have been shot before, or between the ages of 15 and 28, have been associated with groups or, quote unquote gangs. Try to build, the outreach workers build a rapport with these individuals and try to get them onto a path of risk reduction where they're not seeing, the street life as the way for them to function on a day-to-day basis. And then to couple with those different roles, you have events that are aimed at raising awareness about just the vision and work of Cure Violence. They try to partner and place the funding for the sites with organizations that have and provide wraparound resources or services. Those are essential, right? And so we say all the time, you can't kill a person working you can't kill somebody while you're working a 9 to 5. You can't shoot somebody while you're working a 9 to 5, right? If you're gonna take a gun out of somebody's hand, you gotta put something in place of what you just took from them, right? You gotta get them employment. Some people it's on high levels, right? Suffer from mental illnesses, as has been stated by John and those who have spoken before me. So behavioral health is essential. Mentorship, employment, housing, all these different things are stressors that lead and escalate to other things, right? Usually if a conflict happening and you have all these stressors going on in your life, you take that out on, you might exaggerate in terms of your response to certain things that happen that you normally wouldn't. So that's the idea. There's coalitions, of course, and so these organizations don't work in silos. There's an expectation that other organizations partner with the program to make sure there's success. And then when I talked about the areas being Dutchtown, Walnut Park, and even Wells Goodfellow, Hamilton Heights, it's not the entirety of the community unless they open up more sites for those particular spaces. Instead, there's only like a plot of land that the site is responsible for. And so typically that's a 10 by 10 block radius. The Wells Goodfellow, Hamilton Heights area, and the staff talks about it all the time, like because that staff has the most area. It got expanded because of the early success that was happening in this area that it was working. And so that's just like some of the areas of work of the organization. You can go to the next slide. And so for success stories, citywide in St. Louis has been a 25% decrease in homicides, which is dope. It's excellent. In terms of the 10 block radius where the sites are located, there's been a 45% decrease in the homicides. And so one of the stories I wanted to share with you all today was with the brother who de-escalated a knife attack that was going to happen in one of the South Side neighborhoods. But due to the time, I can probably talk about that later in Q&A, but I wanted to share just these with you to show you just a lens into what the program is about and what it's done. And that's it.
Wow, thank you so much, Jonathan. Really, really amazing work, and it's so good to hear about those impacts. I know I have some questions. I'm really curious about the Cure Violence program in St. Louis, but for now, we'll come back to that. And now turn to Sam Vaughn. I met Sam, I think like 6-7 years ago, and learned about the work that he does as a mentor with violence-prone youth in Richmond, California, which was at one time one of the 10 most dangerous cities in the country. He is part of with the Office of Neighborhood Safety in Richmond, and he was mentored by elders himself while he was incarcerated for a decade, and that inspired him to become a community leader and help other young men. He believes that violent youth make better choices for themselves and for their communities when they can really see a healthier path and are given life skills, something that Jonathan was also just talking about. So the Office of Neighborhood Safety Fellowship Program has become like a surrogate family for these young men. More than 80% of them have stayed away from gun violence, and Richmond's homicide rate plummeted, and in the last 2 years did not spike. So really grateful, Sam, for you to be with us here tonight.
Well, thank you very much, John. First, I would like to say there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is the data is absolutely on our side. Everything that has been talked about has been referred to, like the data confirms that, it quantifies that, like we are on the right path. The bad news is most folks who have the ability or the authority to make decisions do not have good critical thinking skills. So with that being said, we will continue to fight this good fight. I will not take up too much of your time because I know we need to leave time for Q&A. But when you speak about all the issues that's been addressed, everything that everybody has said about, we had the momentum, we had the arguments, and now we're losing it because they're skewing the data. Messaging is very important. We have to be conscious of that. Like, we literally have Disney fighting against the fact that, like, no, we love kids. We're not pedophiles. Like, we have to understand the arena that we're in right now, and we cannot fight the way they're fighting, because then we're no better than they are. Law enforcement is very important. It's critical to the survival of this nation. Absolutely is. And I know this is being recorded, and I hope that ain't cut in no soundbite. But it's critical. Like, there's some folks that I definitely don't want to be sitting in the park bench when my kids are on a swing. Like, that's just being honest. But what we've done is we've weaponized law enforcement, and the target is people of color in this country. Laws are important to follow, but slavery was a law. Marrying a 12-year-old was legal. So the laws that are in this country are based on the morals that folks who are in leadership believe to be true. And that is what we need to challenge. We have to challenge that with every ounce of our being. Because if we don't, we will go right back to the war on drugs, war on colored folks, just a war on our existence. This is what we're fighting. And it's going to take everybody. The moderates, the liberals, the leftists, white, black, everything in between. Because this is a humanity issue. We're fighting for the humanity of this country. And it's difficult. And there's going to be a lot of folks, because equality is important. But to the privileged, equality is oppression. And this is our challenge. And so messaging, you cannot attack someone and make them get on your side. You have to convince them. You have to create an argument against, or they can accept through their morals, through their belief. You cannot attack their beliefs. This is the work that we do. Like, we are challenged to create a different thought process in conflict resolution, to where picking up a gun and shooting the folks who disrespected you is your first option. This is the work. It took me a while to realize, like, it's not just the work in these communities. This is the work in this country. You cannot attack someone who has lived their life believing one thing and then explaining to them like your entire existence is a lie and everything you believe is false, and think they're just going to jump right on board with you and fight the good fight. No, you have to create a message to where they understand how this could happen, why it could happen, the economical benefit to certain industries for this happening, and realize like they've been bamboozled just like the rest of us. Like we're enemies, but yet we're really fighting the same battle. And until we can understand that, we will not get anywhere. So we have to really focus on how we communicate with each other, even those who completely disagree with us. That is the only way that we can really get outside of this conundrum that we're in, because it's absurd. You know, literally, it's like they just took the mask mandates out of transportation. So now you got folks feeling very comfortable not wearing a mask, but now they're attacking those who would wear a mask. But their argument was, how dare you control me? And yet now I'm trying to control you, like, be free. So it is really about trying to understand one another's perspective, trying to understand one another's experience, trying to honor and respect that, even if you completely disagree or cannot understand whatsoever. Acknowledging that humanity in each and every one of us, and trying to find a common ground so all can be honored and live in existence. And like I understand the talking points of folks like, yeah, look at all this, defund the police, now look at all this war. Like the data, data argues against that 100%. 100%. Like, we are funding police agencies across this country at an enormous amount of money. But if you look at the areas to where all of these, and I'd love to hear St. Louis numbers from the expert who's out there, but if you look at all of the numbers, like you would realize in urban America, probably where at least 40 to 45% of all gun violence occurs, and where the law enforcement budgets are extremely bloated. They have about an 8 to 16% closure rate on all gun violence occurrences. So how is that effective? How can we justify spending those resources? It's not it's literally messaging, because it's us against them. Like, you had Syracuse police like grab a little boy. It was 3 police officers, 2 police cars. I would love to know the resources that they spent on this arrest of an 8-year-old boy who stole a $2 bag of Doritos. You have NYPD that's spending, they're attempting, and I love how you threw Eric, the mayor, like he's a clown. They're attempting to spend almost $500 million on law enforcement to be in subways to stop like toll stealers, folks jumping the turnstile and getting on the subway for free. And they're saying it's about $200 million worth of loss because of these people. So you're going to justify $300 million on law enforcement over the $200 million they're stealing. Like, how about you just let them walk through?
So Sam, I want to make sure that we get some back and forth. and actually want to ask both you and Jonathan a very concrete question. And maybe turn to Jonathan first and then ask the same question of you. And then I do invite other folks who are here to put questions in the chat, including the one that Teresa has put, the comment that she's put in. Is that all right? Is that okay? Or was there to stop something that you really had to come out?
No, John, you're good.
Okay, so it's a question for both Jonathan and Sam, which is, well, there's kind of two questions that are in my mind, but one is like, what concretely, how do you all spend your time? You know, like in both St. Louis and in Richmond, there have been some really concrete results in your community, in the well-being of people in your neighborhoods, in your community. What do you do? How do, like, can you like, and I'll turn to Jonathan first, like, how do you all, you talked about outreach, you talked about violence interrupters. How do you all actually spend your time? What is it that, what's the sort of fabric of what you're doing that has been so helpful?
Thank you for that question, John. So there's 4 pillars to every week for a Cure Violence site. That's the briefing, debriefing, the weekly supervision, and the one-on-ones and the weekly team meeting. And so those are times in which, those are some of the few times in which the staff in its entirety for a site actually spend time together. And that time is spent talking about what happened in the last 24 hours. Questions like, were there any shootings? Were there any mediations that you all conducted? You know, what were the going-ons of your day? Outside of those group sessions, there are about 4 hours a day spent canvassing, like canvas. And the reason why that is to get not only a pulse on the community for what's happening on that particular day, but also to promote the events and promote the resources and services. Like Sam stated, you know, the police budgets are bloated, even in St. Louis City. And so we don't invest in things like transportation. We don't invest in things like mental health services. We don't invest in things like employment, things that are actually concrete resources that people can use to better themselves. And so by getting the word out regularly during our canvassing, we're able to promote not only those the mission, which of course is to change the norms around violence, the thinking that we have towards violence, but also to put people in touch with resources. And then of course, if there's a shooting that actually happens, unfortunately, there's like a 72-hour window in which every site has to respond in some kind of fashion or form. It could be a vigil, it could be you gathering information on what happened, what occurred, because a lot of this stuff can be retaliatory. So we try to prevent those things from happening as well. But those are some of the ins and outs on what a day-to-day looks like for VI or OW with Cure Violence.
Thanks so much.
So I definitely don't want to repeat everything that's already been said. So all of that, but literally day to day, what we do is we go out there and love on folks who have been told that they don't deserve love. We go out and engage folks who have been told that they're worthless, they're meaningless, they're a drain on this society, but yet they don't even understand their power. They don't understand that their actions is what creates policy. The actions of their parents and their peers and their uncles and aunts, like, it created those huge, enormous police budgets from fear-mongering politicians. Like, we want them to know the power that they hold. We want them to know everything that I also just said earlier. Like, you are being taken advantage of. We're coming up on Juneteenth. Juneteenth is literally the celebration of the last slaves that learned slavery was over. And it was over 2 years after slavery was over. We want them to know, like, of course, your actions are absolutely understandable. Like, with the conditions that were created, that was beyond your control. Like, you are doing exactly what you're supposed to do because this is what was destined for you to do, so that these conditions could be created and be justified. Like, just like we said earlier, Biden literally said, fund the police, fund the police, fund the police. Biden was also the one that really pushed the crime bill in the 90s. You know, but this was also with the Black Caucus's support and urging, like, please help us. Not understanding First of all, like it was CIA who did it to us. And like we are really like missing the mark because we're looking at the cough and trying to give it syrup and not understanding the lung disease that needs surgery and antibiotics. So our day-to-day is trying to expose folks to the reality of where they are, how they got there, how they will continue to sit in the circumstances if they continue to respond to those circumstances where as they have been, and to understand like, yeah, I'm a pawn in a game of chess that I ain't even invited to. So just exposing folks to the truth. That's what we do every single day.
All right. Amazing. So I do want to invite folks to put in questions or comments. We do have several comments you may have seen in the chat from Teresa Elamin, who writes several things about cure violence, that not addressing violence against women. I don't know if Teresa, if you have a direct question that you want to ask, if we take you off mute, if you're able to, or you're saying St. Louis is doing better than most cure violence cities. Cure violence is not about system change. I disagree with the model. It excludes women deliberately. I don't know if Jonathan or Sam or if you want.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you. Glad to have a woman's voice being heard in this discussion because the root cause of the violence in these cities around the country, which is unprecedented. In Columbus, Georgia, where I live, a city of 200,000, cure violence came here a year ago and convinced the elected officials that $500,000 could make a difference. I know in Durham, North Carolina, they spent millions over 5 years, and the murder rate is still very high. Because when you ask men who are formerly incarcerated, men who have been in cages with other men for years, and you ask them to go on the street to talk to other men who have lost their way, it is just so limited. It does not take into consideration the role of women in communities to make a difference. That's why I say it's misogynistic, and it is a very small piece of the puzzle. I'm just opposed to it, really.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa. So that raises a question for both of you, Jonathan and Sam. How do you see the role of anti-sexism or of women or of gender identity in reducing the violence that our communities are experiencing?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and kick it off. I know it was addressed directly towards cure violence. I do want to say, first off, that I think my philosophy is it's impossible for men not to be sexist, right? And so I think that's a lifelong work thing, and it definitely permeates organizations beyond, the police and even in organizations trying to do justice work. As far as like the question around anti-sexism, that's definitely an important lens, a critical lens. And I know for the sites in St. Louis, we do not have enough women involved in the cure violence program. There are other agencies that are also bidding to have sites. And I know one of the organizations is run by a Black woman, staffed by Black women and stuff like that. And so I think that there's some promise in terms of inclusion there. But I don't think that the fight against these homicides and gun violence can be done without sisters on the front line. So I'm in agreement with that. The last point I want to land on is every site is only responsible for a 10 by 10 block radius. And so, for example, let's say that the homicides in the city of St. Louis, while they did go down 25%, And while that does, show some press around work that's being done with Cure Violence and things like that, Cure Violence is only responsible for a 10 by 10 block radius, which is very small. And there are efforts to get more sites so that more land can be covered. And so in my presentation, when I talked about a 45% reduction in participating neighborhoods, those are neighborhoods in which those sites were active and were working. And so, there's that point too, but the work to address a lot of the ills, things like that, are definitely ongoing. And I just wanted to make those 3 points. Thank you, Sister Teresa, for bringing those up, though.
Yeah. Sam, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so this was a sister named Teresa, correct, who asked this question? All right. And so what I will say is she is absolutely correct, 100%. But when you look at it from a different perspective, a trauma surgeon in Chicago is mostly likely to understand the male anatomy because it is males that is on their surgery table every single day of their existence. But public health also has gynecology, and so as we continue to look at this as this is the problem or this is the problem, we always throw resources at that problem, but we have still yet to find a way to collectively understand what has happened in these communities to create this type of environment. And so you want to say, oh, it's gun violence, or oh, it's drugs, or oh, it's lack of education, or lack of resources. It's all and. But we've never tackled any single community with resources to deal with all and. It's just, let's deal with this, or let's deal with this. And you definitely will get some results, but you are not getting the maximized results that you could if you dealt with all and. Like, okay, we got to deal with education. Well, let's deal with property taxes. Like, let's deal with the issue of redlining. Let's deal with all these things. And then, the medical concerns. Okay, well, let's deal with the fact that this entire community ain't got no damn hospital or no grocery stores. Like, wow, I got to go into a liquor store and buy a bell pepper. Like, there's so much that has been created to make these conditions happen. And we all, Sister Teresa included, she's sitting back looking at her sisters be denied and not have access to what she sees other folks have. And it's absolutely absurd, and it's unconscionable, and it should be unacceptable. But we have not created this ecosystem to where all of these conditions that have created our circumstances have been dealt with at the exact same time, so we can actually see how we can flourish if we had the same opportunities as everybody else.
Yeah. And it does seem like you and Teresa are on the same page. I mean, she just said systems change is what we need, and that's exactly what you just described, right?
But what system? Like, we say
everything all and, use it like all and, right?
So it's criminal justice system. Let's change that. Or it's the education system. Let's change that. Or it's all these different systems. And they were created to work in silos so they could never benefit us as a whole. Like, we have to understand that. And so when we look at law enforcement, when we talk about this system was not built for us. This is the system that made it illegal to walk on the train tracks to get to work, so we can lock you up and get 4 years of free labor from you because this damn federal government system said it ain't okay for me to own you no more. Like, we have to understand what this process is and how we got here. And it was not designed by accident. It is continually trying to confuse us and have us combating each other. Like, Black Lives Matter. All lives matter. Yes, all lives matter. They absolutely do, but they don't until you understand Black Lives Matter. Like, aren't we part? We're part of that all, correct? Immigrant lives matter. LGBTQ lives, like we're all part of that. But the one who's at the bottom of the totem pole, they're looking like, well, what the hell? I thought all lives matter. So they're gonna have their own hashtag, and then that own hashtag is attacked for being like segregating and selfish, and like, no, we just want what you got. That's all. We ain't asking for nothing else.
There you are. There's so many pieces to this to work on. Thank you so much for taking us through that. We want to give some time for the people who've been taking this in. I hope listening deeply, thinking about what it means in your own lives and work and communities. And I'm going to turn it over to Mary now. I don't know if I don't see any other questions, but we might be able to bring those up in breakout groups, because we're going to go into smaller groups now and have a chance to reflect. Go ahead, Mary.
Yeah, thank you so much for really interesting discussion. And yeah, I mean, it's so obvious we're really only scratching the surface here. There's so much complexity, and I appreciate so much, Sam and Jonathan, what you brought to the table, and also Teresa's intervention. We were actually really trying to have a woman speaking on this panel too. That's another system, right? Misogyny is another system that we're all working on, all of these things all the time. So appreciate you bringing that in. There is good work being done by women on this issue. And so I hope we can have another round of unpacking all this, but we are all trying to do the same thing, I think. And that is to address these issues in a human-centered way and without funneling more people into the carceral system. That's what we're really actively working against. So with all of this incredible knowledge that we just have been absorbing, we just wanted to get into some quick small groups, and just any thoughts you have about now, how can you add complexity or challenge the dominant narrative that we know is being spread out there the next time it comes up and you're in a discussion. So I'll stop talking. Let's just jump into these small groups, see if you can have some good discussion with your neighbors, and then we'll come back and see if what folks had to say. You know, we just have a few minutes left to chat. Anybody want to share? I think we're all unmuted now. So does anybody want to share anything interesting that came up in their group? Any thoughts? It's fine if your conversation strayed. I know we were getting to know each other in our group, actually, which was really nice. Ended up talking about feminist peacemaking, which was awesome. But yeah, any insights, or if people just have thoughts that they want to share beyond the small group conversations, but just about the topic at hand this evening, you can feel free to unmute yourself and just jump in.
Well, I would appreciate it, Mary, because the American Friends Service Committee is one of the few over 100-year-old organizations in the U.S., along with WILF and FOR and the NAACP. And I'd just like to hear how you came to be involved in this particular area of work, given your long history of being involved in so many movements. How are you focused so much on the gun violence issue in the United States? How did you arrive at this?
Oh, thanks for that question. I mean, I think actually this conversation came more out of our focus on police violence and sort of the prison industrial complex. You may know that the AFSC board endorsed prison abolition back in 1978. And it's been a long journey of our healing justice work, going through many different iterations and deepening their work and analysis. Number of us doing work on policing and surveillance in those intervening years. And just this past spring, our board endorsed our deeper vision, which is called the North Star vision document, where we've really committed to looking at, really disrupting the punishment paradigm. And so looking at policing and surveillance as being part of that, along with prisons. And so we just saw, because of our work on this issue over the last several years, we saw the opportunity that 2020 brought in terms of, stopping police violence. The thousands of people who were, paying attention to that issue, millions. Actually, they're saying the Black Lives Matter movement in that 2020 era was like the largest social movement in history, right? So, I think a lot of us never expected that moment to come. And so we have really deepened our work in the last 2 years. In this discussion, we really wanted to begin to broach the topic, I think, because we saw that this issue is real, the fear is real for people, and that the rhetoric is being used to capitalize on that fear, and was potentially setting back a lot of things that had happened that had been positive in the last several years, as Akira shared with us at the beginning. So that's kind of where the conversation comes out. I want to invite my colleagues if anybody wants to add to that or add complexity or other thoughts. John or Tori or anybody want to add to that?
So Maggie and Sarah have put a couple things in the chat, including that North Star document in which this activity sits, as well as Sarah putting in the other webinars of which this is a part, which is really taking a look at lots of different aspects of policing. So this issue of what is the relationship between policing and community violence versus other types of interventions or all and systemic changes that are needed. It's part of a broader approach to address community safety in ways that don't continue the same model of racist policing and overinvestment in something and underinvestment in other things.
Yeah, thank you, John. Yeah, any other thoughts or questions before we close out? We were really excited to get to meet a lot of you tonight, and hope that you'll consider coming to our next webinar. We also have some, right now we're starting a process of study into action groups, which are meant to take these conversations to a deeper level and hopefully seed some organizing projects in your community. And we're in the middle of one on building community alternatives to police response. And that one's not, you couldn't join that one now, but maybe we'll repeat it. And then we're gonna have a restorative justice one coming up in the early fall. So you can follow that link and see other ways that you can engage with this work other than the webinars.
Mary, if I could just mention one thing. In 2019, there was a national end mass incarceration conference at the Ebenezer Church that's faith-based. Over 1,000 people showed up. And our now Senator Warnock, who is still the senior pastor at Ebenezer, we're planning for the second conference of that type, which will be in January of 2023. So I'm working closely with the Ebenezer Church on this, and we're doing a lot of focus on expungement and other issues associated with how do we keep people out of prison and making people whole to participate in society. So it is transformative work. And I just like to know, I've never quite known how to join American Friends Service Committee, but I do want to support the work that you do and stay closely connected. I'm in Columbus, Georgia, but I remember there was a strong presence of American Friends Service Committee in Atlanta. Do you still have that presence in Atlanta?
We do, actually, and their work is more focused on gentrification and housing rights, but they're doing really great work down there. And we should definitely, I've got your number from the chat, and we should, I can connect you with those folks, and we'd love to hear more about the 2023 conference. And, we should definitely.
On May 4th, there'll be a luncheon at Ebenezer Church. So it will be great to have representation from American Friends Service Committee. And Ebenezer does great free lunch.
That's amazing.
It is a huge place, and they have lots of resources. So let's stay connected, because I'm in the Atlanta area a lot. I'm just 100 miles from there. So I go there a lot. It is so great to be connected with you, Mary. Thank you.
Oh, likewise, Teresa. And actually, our colleague Maggie and Ophelia, who are in New Hampshire, would like to connect with you too. So if you check the chat.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm using my phone, so I would appreciate it if people would simply text me at my number so I can save your contact information. So
That sounds great.
I can't save the chat or do anything with the phone thing. So if you could just text me. But this is really so great to be connected with you.
Likewise. And yeah, so till soon. We'll close out now because I know it's getting late. And but I love that everybody stayed for the small groups. It's sometimes some of the best part of the webinars. So super grateful for everybody's participation this evening, and we're looking forward to meeting again and continuing the work. So I hope everybody has a great evening. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks. Good night.
Thank you very much.